Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Hi everybody, this is Andrew Houghtonville from the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability. Thank you for joining us today. Let's jump straight into things. Elaine, are you going to do this part or am I?
I can do it if you like. So welcome everybody. Today's nTIDE Lunch and Learn is a joint effort of the University of New Hampshire, Kessler Foundation, and the Association of University Centers on Disability. It happens every Friday, Jobs Friday, the first Friday of every month at 12 noon. And it's a part of the Rehabilitation Research Training Center on Employment and Policy and Measurement, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, often known as NIDE. Next slide, please. So for today's program, there's 4 parts. And I'm going to turn it back to Andrew to guide you.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. I jumped to your part a little too soon. Sorry. So the first part is just the numbers. So the nTIDE report that was released this morning. Elaine and I will be presenting that. The part 2 is nTIDE News. Denise Roselle from AUCD will be taking that part. We have a guest speaker, Maureen from George Washington University. And if you haven't been with us in a while, we've moved the Q&A section to the very end for all 3 parts. So as before, we still have the chat function, so you can ask questions directly. With that, let's turn to the numbers. And Elaine.
Yes, okay, next slide, please. So the monthly nTIDE report is a press release and an infographic that looks at the employment statistics issued by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics through a disability lens, reporting on the job situation, employment situation on the first Friday of each month, known as Jobs Friday. Next slide. So our nTIDE report is compiled from data issued by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Current Population Survey, or CPS. It's the official source of the unemployment rate that's used in the news. Our statistics include civilians aged 16 through 64 not living in institutions. This information has been available on the CPS since 2008, and that's the year that 6 disability questions were added to many of the federal surveys. Since our data is not seasonally adjusted, we compare the data to the same month as last year rather than a month-to-month comparison. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Elaine. So let's get right to the numbers. All right, so we're looking at August 2018 compared to August 2019, and we had some good news. So the employment rate, the employment to population ratio, which is the percentage of the population that is employed, could be full-time or part-time. It's just being employed for pay. And that went up from 30.2% to 32%. That's a jump of 1.8 percentage points or 6%. So for people without disabilities, it also went up in August, from August 2018 to August 2019. By not quite as much, from 73.8 to 74.6. That's about 0.8 percentage points and 1.1%. Of course, you can still see there's a substantial gap between people with and without disabilities. the labor force participation rate. So it's frequently cited in the literature and in the news. This is not only the percentage of people who are working, which was the previous slide, but it also adds in people who are actively looking for work. And so that also went up as an indicator from 33% to 34.7%, and it went up for people without disabilities from 76.7% to 77.4%. So again, this is actually good news for people with disabilities, and the population is actually outpacing people without disabilities. Many times we want to look at the trend, as Elaine mentioned. The data goes back to 2008 when they first added disability questions to the current population survey, which is the underlying source for the official unemployment rate released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics on this morning at 8:30. What we can see is the long-term trend for people with and without disabilities. And if I had to look, we're still not at that. Oops, let me go back. Go back. Previous. If you look at the slide, we're back in, this is October 2018 or 2008. We're still not back up to that level. For people with disabilities, that level was reached, a couple years ago. The pre-recession rate was below. This decline for people with disabilities, for people without disabilities, you see this dramatic decline. That's the Great Recession. And then you see this wavy, and this is the seasonal aspect of the economy. You see a slow increase that's continued to the current day. For people without disabilities, the decline, they were certainly hit by the Great Recession, but the decline continued all the way till about 2013-14, and then we've seen a steady increase over time. In the most recent months, though, the most recent years, we've kind of had a little bit of tapering off. And, over the last 2 years, the upward trend we saw in, say, 2016-17 kind of waned in 2018 and 2019. Now, the last 4 months, we've seen increases. Perhaps this is a return, hopefully, to the previous the previous upward increase. Some people may be wondering with the sign, discussions about the softening of the economy. People have used the word recession coming. Employment really lags behind that. Most recession indicators are based on economic growth, so the gross domestic product, GDP. That's what really dictates when we're in recession or out of recession. Employment typically follows the business cycle like economic growth, but it usually lags behind a bit. It's not, you'll usually see the economy GDP decline, and the employment shocks won't occur for several months after. So, I don't expect to see employment picture declining anytime soon, but depending on whether the GDP economic growth declines. So we see the long-term trend. So again, kind of the decline early on for people without disabilities, and that decline continuing and then increasing recently. I'm going to turn it over to Denise now for news. And if you have any questions, again, it's at the end of the webinar where we'll be answering questions. Denise, take it away.
Terrific. Hi, everybody. So when we usually start, we talk about what's going on from federal policies point of view, and you can see there's actually a lot going on. So let's, not necessarily in Congress, but across the board. So let's start. We talked last month about the fact that there was a budget deal, which means that the Congress came into agreement on how much money they would spend. But that doesn't assign the amounts to every department. That's when you get to appropriations. So the appropriations processes are starting. As a matter of fact, the Senate, I believe, is going to mark up their appropriations bill for the labor, HHS, ed departments next Thursday, the 12th, we expect, in the Senate, and it'll start there. The House passed their appropriations bills long back into the early spring and early summer. The problem is they didn't have the budget deal then, and now the budget deal says that the numbers the House can use, the top number the House can appropriate, is less than the number that they did appropriate. So now they have to go back and redo it. So we're going to see that happening as well. But most of the things we care about are in the House and Senate appropriations bills. In labor, HHS, ed, we'll start looking and we'll start seeing some of that next week. Okay, as I said, not all of this was things that are happening in Congress. So something else that happened, we talked probably the end of last year about public charge and the idea that there might be a change in what is called the public charge rule. Well, that change actually happened this week. We filed comments to an RFP that was out back the end of last year. It came out this year. So what is that? Public charge is the term that is used by the U.S. Immigration Service to refer to a person who is considered primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. And usually what they say is someone who is a public charge, that is, they are receiving what the Immigration Service feels are too many benefits from the country, can be denied entry into the country and can be denied their green card. So this change, originally public charge as it was applied before the change that happened a couple week ago, usually what the government would look at was cash assistance. So they would say, are these folks on TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, or SSI, getting Social Security income? That could be counted against someone staying in the country. Also, they could do government-funded long-term care. That could also be counted against someone and whether they would stay in the country or not. But the new rule, and most folks in the disability community commented against this going into effect, but we didn't win this one. The new rule says they can also consider Medicaid, whether you are on, for instance, non-emergency Medicaid. There's emergency exceptions for that, but if you're on non-emergency Medicaid, that can count against you. SNAP, food stamps, in other words, if you're receiving food stamps, and if you're getting housing assistance, public housing, Section 8 housing vouchers, those kinds of things. All of those things can be counted against you in whether you can stay in the country or whether you can get a green card, or frankly, if you can come into the country. There have been a whole host of, like I said, there's lots of comments from the disability community, the aging community, others who were fearful that this would impact people's, it would impact people with disabilities in ways that were not going to be helpful, because they wouldn't be able to stay, and particularly where those are families, or if it's kids who are getting things but their families are here. There's a lot of ramifications to this that we were worried about and continue to worry about. The other one that has popped up, and this is now going into effect, the rule was published in the Federal Register. It's supposed to go into effect on October 15th. There's been litigation filed against it in a number of states, quite a number of states, frankly. A number of disability organizations have signed on to some of that litigation, again, in various states, to stop this from going into effect and to say that this is, it would have too much of a chilling effect and that it doesn't necessarily do what they're seeking to do. The two interesting things that have happened since this, other than since it came out, I think it was issued the 20th of August maybe, two interesting things have happened. One, like I said, lots of litigation is being filed, including litigation by disability organizations, attorneys generals in states. Disability organizations have joined attorneys generals, et cetera, et cetera. There's one state that we have heard about, and I think it's Connecticut, where when the state files the litigation to stop this from being implemented, the state is talking about also making a 504 claim, that by doing this, it may violate 504. That'll be an interesting one to watch. The other thing that's been interesting that we have drawn a lot more attention to in the last, I don't know, several months, I guess, is the effect of public charge on the direct service personnel workforce. Think about the number, who is employed in the DSP workforce. Think about how many of those folks may be on, particularly because of the poor pay in that workforce, how many of those folks may be on food stamps, maybe on vouchers, public housing. in public housing or on Section 8 vouchers. Think about how many of those folks come from other countries. And primarily in that workforce, there's a huge amount of folks from other countries who are doing that work here. So think about what that will have, the effect that will have, and then in turn, the effect that has on the people with disabilities that they are serving. So I really call this one, there's a lot of good information out on this one, all over the place.
We could actually calculate that latter, the DSPs who are.
Oh, that would be
foreign
fascinating,
nationals.
actually, Andrew. That would be fascinating.
That's possibly in the data.
That would be great, because this is a big threat, and being able to carry that data forward in some of this litigation would be interesting. There are, again, AUCD has information out there on our website on it, the ARC, UCP, Justice in Aging, a number of the aging groups. Justice in Aging is legal services kind of for folks in the aging community. I haven't looked, but I'm sure NDRN has stuff up there on this. So this is one of those things that I would say go out and look and see what's available. There's lots of information available about the tie between this and the disability community. Okay, another one. This is another one that's from not Congress, but somewhere else. Department of Labor issued an interesting rule, fascinating rule, actually, an interpretation on family and medical leave, that they have ruled that IEP meetings, baby U's, parents may take time off from work intermittently under FMLA to attend IEP meetings. It was a ruling that was in response to a letter from a person in, I can't remember the state now, I guess it doesn't matter, a family's complaint that the mother was allowed to take time off for her children's medical appointments, but not for her children without disabilities, medical appointments, but was not allowed to take time off for her child with the disabilities IEP meetings. And the Department of Labor said, no, that's not right. As a matter of fact, the language I thought was really interesting. The language says, IEP meetings help participants make medical decisions concerning your children's medically prescribed speech, physical, and occupational therapy, to discuss your child's well-being and progress with the providers of such services, and to ensure that your children's school environment is suitable to their medical, social, and academic needs. I thought that was really nicely written. It's a good letter. It's one of those things that I think for folks who are working with employers and employees, this is something that we want to share. So I share that with you guys, knowing that that's what you'll do. The next one, you can see a lot of these things are issues that are kind of in the news these days that I wanted to bring to your attention, and the impact on disability and on employment. So obviously there's been a lot in the news lately around guns, safety, and particularly tying some of those issues to mental illness incorrectly, obviously. The Senate Judiciary, Health, and the Homeland Security Committees are all considering legislation around this that frankly could harm disability civil rights and stigmatize people with disabilities. That whole idea that guns are a mental health issue alone. So there's a lot of, there's talk about opening registries and other things to address gun violence. So I wanted to make sure that I said to you, there's a lot of information out there on this. There's a webinar, as a matter of fact, let's flip to that and then we'll flip back. Andrew, would you flip to the next slide? I think it's my next slide, yeah. So there's a webinar that AUCD's Mental Health Aspects of IDD, SIG, Special Interest Group, is doing on September 26th, looking at the history of stigma associating mental illness and guns, looking at the facts on the relationships and the research, the real risk factors for gun violence and how you identify those, and rational approaches to prevention. This is by Jill Hinton. She's from the Center for Start Services. She's in North Carolina. So, and that's free. Anybody can, you don't have to be an AUCD member or affiliated with us.
Jill is part of the Center for Start Services, is actually part of the Institute on Disability.
Oh, I didn't know that. Excellent.
Yeah, there you go.
They're fabulous. The other thing, Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law has a lot of good information on this issue. There's a statement, there's a review of all kinds of information. I gave you the links, or you can just search on bazelon.org. There's a lot of good information out there around this. And part of what I think all of our responsibility within the disability community is to share that information with folks and say, and present the facts. Here are the facts. Here's what this means. I don't care where you are on the whole gun issue. I'm not sure on some level that it matters, as long as we understand it matters to you, but that it matters overall in this framework, as long as we're getting the facts out there. This is the relationship or not. This is what you can say or not. This is what the research shows or not. And I think that's a real service that all of us in the disability community, whether you're in the mental health community or any other community, can take on. Okay, flip back to the previous slide, Andrew. I think I just had one more thing on the bottom of that one. We'll find previous in a minute. There he is. Nope, one more. There you go. Campaign activity. So as I'm sure you've been reading in the paper, lots of people, there's a campaign going on. Lots of people are getting ready to retire. Lots of members of Congress have announced retirements lately. I think it's 3 Democrats and 14 Republicans right now, but there are also open seats out there. There's lots going on already. I said to you last month that because they were in recess, and in case you were in a state that was seeing lots of the presidential candidates, go out and ask them some disability questions. Well, I'm saying the same thing here, but I'm kind of targeting a bigger population. There are lots of open seats. Go find out who's running for those seats in your area if you have an open one, or if you have a retirement going on. Check in on those retiring. Maybe they want to do something special before they have to retire. Sometimes they will sign on to things they wouldn't have signed on to before because they're retiring and they don't have the same kind of pressures. And then check in with those who are running. See what they think about disability employment. See what they know about the Transforming Employment Act. See what they know about sheltered work versus competitive integrated employment. Ask those questions, and the more chance that you have now, particularly with new people running, to build or bill yourself as an expert in this arena, which obviously all of you are, the more chance you have to bill yourself as an expert. They get to know you now, early. They're going to come to you later. And those relationships can only help. And I'm not saying one party or the other. I'm saying you can be a resource to all of them. It doesn't matter. You have the data. And that's really important. So go out and ask questions. Okay, next slide, and then the next one after that. Okay, again, things in the news right now that I really thought you needed to know about, whether they're directly tied to employment or not. There's some really good disaster relief for people, targeted for people with disabilities out there, information. There's a new one right now that just came out called the Long-Term Disaster Recovery Toolkit for Individuals with Disabilities. And it specifically looks at those long-term recovery needs post-disaster. It was funded by Red Cross and Rebuild Texas in collaboration with the Center for Disability Philanthropy. And it's done by the folks at the Project Red at Texas A&M, which is why I also gave you the link to them. Project Red at Texas A&M has some of the most extensive disability information on disaster relief. They've got research and evaluation, training, education for service providers, for families, for individuals. There's lots of information there. And for those of you who have been looking for that, I know I've gotten a number of questions from folks around the country just reaching out to say, I need some information about this. Or all of a sudden my university, which has never been worried about disaster relief for people with disabilities or disaster relief or recovery for people with disabilities before, is now interested, and I have an entree and I want to share information. Or my employer is now reaching out because they never thought about the fact they might have to evacuate somebody from the 10th floor and they're looking for information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one really good place to go. There are a number of others. Portlight is another one. There are a number of other good places to look for this information. But since they had a brand new toolkit come out literally right now, I thought I would highlight that one for you. Next slide, Andrew. Working Works, I didn't put the link in there. I'm sorry, folks. Well, if you search on Working Works, it'll pop up. Working Works is by the Campaign for Disability Employment. They're co-sponsored by AAPD, Hearne, Disability in, SHRM, the HR people, Special Olympics, NOD, National Organization on Disability, JAN. You can see it's a public-private partnership, basically, and it's across disability as well as human resources and others. They've had a good PSA, and I think I talked to you about the PSA at one point, but they now have it on DVD. They have a discussion guide. It's in English and Spanish. It's free. There are a variety of discussion guides that target issues, whether it be coworkers or employers or healthcare professionals. And there are also a variety of versions of the PSA. So this is another really good way to get some information out there. I don't know if you guys have ever tried, and I'm not sure I've talked to you about it before, but if you haven't, gone to like your local cable station and said, hey, I got a great PSA, would you like to show it? Lots of places these days, particularly with the proliferation of a variety of stations everywhere, are looking for these kinds of things. And even if they show it on Sunday afternoon at, 2 o'clock, that's fine. It gets you an entree. It gets information out there. They're really well done. And it's talking about stay at work, return to work. So a really good one. Like I said, I didn't give you the link. I'm sorry. Search Working Works and it'll come up. Okay, next slide, Andrew. Compendium of Disability Data Collection Methods. This is interesting. This is from, and maybe all of you know about this, but I bet Andrew does, but I didn't. It's a Mathematica. It was through the Disability Statistics and Measurements Rehab Research and Training, the Stats RRTC. It's on, it indexed, what I thought was interesting was an index, a reference list of 220 references to relevant studies around methodological issues with collecting data from or about people with disabilities. For those of you who are on the call who are researchers and others, I just thought it might come in handy, frankly. That's it. Okay, next one, Andrew. StateData has a couple of new things out too that I thought were interesting, particularly the first one, which is looking at exiting VR with employment by race for individuals with ID. So in other words, it's looking at RSA data to explore racial disparities within the delivery of VR services to individuals with intellectual disabilities. And there's been so much talk, and there's been a good deal of research, but I think any new research we get that looks at racial disparities is really important. We don't, clearly in the disability community, we try hard, we do, but I don't know that anybody does as good a job as we could around trying to explore the racial disparities and then try to figure out what to do about combating those. And then the last one was interesting, only because it's very similar to some of the things that Andrew and the folks at University of New Hampshire and others who do this call are doing. And it's based on the American Community Survey, which is kind of employment rates, looks at that across various disability types. It's just another look at some of the same data that we look at every month. So from that point of view, I thought it was interesting. Next slide, Andrew. I'm getting close on my time. Yes, I am. Money follows the person. There's a new thing out from Steve Kay, who I hope you all know is probably the expert on money follows the person in the country. So this is evidence of the impact of money follows, particularly since we finally just got it refunded for a period of years. I think the more data we've got on this to sell the next time around, as well as the more we can track this for now, the better. So this has multiple data, and Steve is just a genius with data. So, accesses multiple data sources, separate analysis for people with and without IDD, state comparisons, looks at aging versus DD. There's a lot of really interesting information in there, and the more that we can show data on money follows. I think the reason it just got refunded, frankly, legislatively, was a lot because we could show some of the data, and this continues that study. Next slide. Oh, NDEAM. Okay, so we are getting close. NDEAM is the National Disability Employment Month. There's an A in there, and I'm totally spacing on it. It's very embarrassing. So there's ways, the new theme this year is accessibility. It's got to be employment accessibility. The right talent right now is very specific. There's a lot of information targeted to employers, employee research groups, supervisors, and then there's information targeted to policymakers. There's specific information targeted to associations and unions. There's lots of material, lots of information. National Disability Employment Month is October, so the information is there for you. People, and my guess is, again, I'm talking a lot about media today. Media is going to be looking for information from you about employment to the extent that you interact with media. So this is a great one too.
The A is for awareness.
Thank you. Gosh, that's embarrassing. I apologize to the folks at ODEP. I should have known that. Okay, next slide. Paul Hearne Award nominations. I couldn't leave without talking about this. The Paul Hearne Emerging Leader Award is awarded by AAPD every year. What's interesting about this, it goes to 2 people, and what's interesting about it is it gives money. There aren't all that many awards within the disability community that give money, and particularly money to emerging leaders who are trying to do something different and exciting and a new initiative. It's $2,500 in recognition of the outstanding contributions in the past, but $7,500 to further new and existing initiatives. So I wanted to be sure and share this with you. Applications are due October 2nd. You can either search on the AAPD site or the Paul Hearne. There's a link up there. This is a great way to showcase somebody doing really good work from, kind of the next generation. I can say that it's the next generation after me. It's probably 3 generations after me, but you get the idea. Emerging leaders in this field. So please share this widely. There's a lot of good information there. And there's a lot of exciting things happening. I'd love to see people get recognized for that. Next slide. Oh, it's to save the date. Perfect. So save the date, the Annual Disability Statistics Compendium, February 11th at the Holiday in Washington, online or in person. You'll hear more. Okay. I think that moves me through mine and I get to introduce Maureen. Good. So Maureen McGuire-Couletz. I don't want to screw that up. Maureen McGuire-Couletz is an associate professor at George Washington University. She's also the co-director of the Center for Rehabilitation Counseling, Research, and Education. And she's going to tell us about an exciting new project targeting underserved populations. And I am really looking forward to hearing this one. So Maureen, I'm going to toss it to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk a little bit about this very exciting project. It is Project E3, Educate, Empower, and Employ. And it is a center that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Rehabilitation Services Administration. And it is a strategic partnership led by the Southern University in Baton Rouge in partnership with a number of other institutions of higher ed, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Stout, obviously George Washington University, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, University of Kentucky at Lexington, Virginia Commonwealth University, Employment Resources, Inc., and the Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation. So it's a very robust project. I also want to mention that we are entering year 5 of the project on October 5th, and we're just starting to analyze some of the data and the promising practices that have grown for our involvement in this project. Next slide, please. So the driving issue is that vocational rehabilitation alone has not been able to address the persistent, pervasive, and multi-layered needs of the economically disadvantaged targeted communities that are high leverage groups with national applicability. The idea is to ensure employment opportunities for people with disabilities, and not only people with disabilities, but also to include employers, government, and society. Next slide, please. So, what's the purpose of this project? It's to provide technical assistance, TA, to state vocational rehabilitation agencies and their partners to address barriers to VR participation and competitive integrated employment of historically underserved groups of individuals with disabilities. So intensive TA is provided on-site through long-term service delivery relationships with local VR agency personnel and community-based partners in economically disadvantaged communities identified by state VR agencies, as well as members of those communities. In this partnership, we provide both targeted and universal TA. Next slide, please. So, what's a targeted community? How do you define it? Targeted communities are defined as any economically disadvantaged community that qualifies as an empowerment zone. So, how do you get qualified as an empowerment zone? The median household income is under 200% of the federal poverty level. The unemployment rate is at or above the national average. As a group, as we all know, everyone on this call knows, that individuals with disabilities have historically sought and been eligible for, or those who have received vocational rehabilitation services, or have achieved competitive integrated at 65% of this less of the state VR agency's employment outcome levels. Our folks, people with disabilities, ourselves are underserved in terms of, and are highly represented in terms of low income areas. Next slide, please. So, what are the outcomes of this project? The outcome obviously is to work with people that have traditionally been underserved in low income communities. And the desired outcome is to increase participation in state vocational rehabilitation programs, increase the number and percentage of individuals served through state VR programs who complete their program and enter into competitive integrated employment, to increase the amount of support services provided through community agencies and support systems to those who are participating in vocational rehabilitation programs, and to develop collaborative, coordinated service strategies among VR programs and community support services and agencies to provide more comprehensive services to folks who are engaged in the VR system. In other words, to look at more wraparound services, because as we all know, it takes a community to help somebody succeed and move forward with their vocational goals. So, Project E3, Educate, Empower, Employ, benefits state VR agencies by increasing their ability and capacity to identify, engage, and expand services for VR eligible, economically disadvantaged individuals who could benefit from those services. It looks to establish or expand upon partnerships with local social service agencies, community development agencies, correctional facilities, community-based rehabilitation programs, school systems, employers, community leaders, faith-based organizations, and other relevant stakeholders. And implement comprehensive support services to increase VR participation rates of individuals in high leverage groups with national applicability by addressing systemic barriers such as poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, safety concerns, interpersonal and family issues, language barriers, lack of transportation, childcare, and a number of other issues relevant to folks that live in poverty. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number of proposed interventions that have been used on this project. I'm going to first talk a little bit about some of the interventions that have been used, and then I'm going to talk about where some of these projects are located at this time. So I want to be very clear, though, that they're just a sampling of the projects, that these are not the only ones that have been used, but these are a number that we have found to be very successful. And the first is motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is an evidence-based approach that promotes behavioral changes and addresses ambivalence to behavior change through the use of client-centered approaches. It's been offered in a number of the E3 communities, and it's found to be a useful strategy to help people deal with concerns and ambivalence about potentially losing benefits, about being willing to make changes. And it's also very conducive in public rehabilitation counseling programs. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've started working on and found to be very successful is financial capability strategies. People with disabilities, as we know, continue to disproportionately live in poverty, and are often excluded from mainstream financial system, largely due to policies that require people to remain in poverty in order to access basic health care. What we have found is that asset building coalitions, mainstream financial industry often don't target people with disabilities because of their misconceptions about folks' ability to work, earn, and save while maintaining public benefits. We've taken on a two-prong approach in terms of trying to do a better job of educating folks about Social Security benefits, work incentives, asset development strategies, and while also helping vocational rehabilitation and community partners I talked about earlier to understand the importance of these issues relative to successful long-term job retention. I should mention at this point that one of our biggest proponents of doing this and supporters have been actually the banks and financial institutions themselves. It's been very interesting. If you think about it, if you're getting more people to do banking and to, you're really building your customer base, and they find that people with disabilities are a great customer base. So we found that to be very interesting. Next slide, please. Another model that we have found very, very helpful and effective, we call it Braiding and Leveraging Resources, the Integrated Resource Team Model, IRT. And it's a bottoms-up approach to systems capacity building. It fosters cross-boundary collaboration across multiple systems and service providers, bringing them together around the needs of an individual consumer who is already touched by or potentially eligible for services. It's centered around a consumer-driven meeting with all the systems and service providers for the consumer involved and present to discuss the needs, plans, and their roles in establishing a mutually agreed upon shared goal, employment, lines of communication, and sequence and services. It's an organic opportunity to promote systems capability building through knowledge translation with each agency. We're not asking anybody to do anything that they would not normally do, but instead to better communicate to help the consumer. The IRT meeting is an organic opportunity to promote system capability and capacity building through experiential knowledge translation, learning. As I said, it's not a duplication of services, but instead a coordination of services led by the consumer who's receiving those services. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, great, thank you. Actually, Bridges Out of Poverty training is one of the, I should probably have moved it up earlier in my slide, we have found to be very, very helpful. One of the things that we often find, this is training that's offered to the community and to service providers. It is a comprehensive approach to understanding poverty. It uses the lens of economic class and provides concrete tools and strategies for a community to alleviate poverty. Participants review poverty research, examine a theory of change, analyze poverty through the prism of hidden rules of class, resources, family structure, and language. And then it discusses the impact of residing in a socioeconomically disadvantaged community on motivation and behavior, impact of poverty on family structure, and the challenges that poverty creates in terms of resources needed for a stable life. And then the training is coupled with facilitated discussion with community members to help them look at some strategies that they could use to help the folks that they're working with. I often talk about wearing my educator hat, that sometimes we tend to, as people who provide services, to look at poverty through what I call a middle class lens, not thinking at all about the challenge of, do I have the bus money to get to a job interview? Who's going to watch my child? What if my car breaks down? And helping people problem solve and work through those strategies. Next slide, please. Another strategy that next slide, please. Community, oh, I'm sorry, go back. Community academies, I apologize. So the purpose of community academies is for community partners to better understand local resources. What we find is that often service providers know their services and the few people that they do deal with, but they don't often keep up with the changes in other services, therefore missing an opportunity for partnership. And the community academies, really quickly, the way we do them, we bring a large group of entities together, everyone's welcome, and we give them 3 minutes to talk about their services, no PowerPoints allowed, and they talk about eligibility, services provided, and the goals of the program. And then we do it periodically so that people can keep up with changes in programs, new funding opportunities. Okay, next slide, please. Communities of practice. The communities of practice, as you all know, are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. You will find when you go to our website, and I'll give you the address later on, that we have several communities of practice. Anyone is welcome to join. We focus on issues around disability, poverty, employment, a number of other things based on what interests are, as well as closed communities of practice within each of the communities where we work, so that they can share resources, talk about challenges. Next slide, please. So where are our targeted communities located? Well, we have a number of communities that were nominated for this project, but with the short amount of time to work in the communities, the selection focused on areas with a strong VR and community partnership, and an interest in creating change and improving services to their communities. So the following are some of the states that were finally selected for this project. I'm not going to have time today to go into a lot of detail, but if you visit our website, we have in-depth information about the communities, how you can find out more, and if you're interested, how you can get more involved. So the communities are South Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, Oregon, North Carolina, and Kentucky. In each one of these states, different strategies and interventions were identified based on the community-based participatory research model I just talked about a few minutes ago. What they did was we worked in partnership with the community, their representative, researchers, and others to identify what the problems were and have the community help us understand what their priorities were. This approach helps us recognize the strength of every member of the community. And next slide, please. Some other locations are New Mexico, New Hampshire, Montana, which is interesting in that it's 2 tribal programs we're working with, Illinois, California, and Louisiana. In each one of these states, as I said, there's 2 communities within the state that we work with. We work with one community to start off, and then we look at what are promising practices and try to duplicate it in the second community. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. Last slide, please. Okay, for additional information, please visit projecte3.com. I have my email address up there, mkuletz@gwu.edu. I'll be happy to take any questions. I want to let you know there's asynchronous training for CEU and CRC credit available on the website. Anyone's welcome to come. There are lots of resources and information available for anybody who's interested in this topic. Thank you very much for your time today.
Great, thank you. I was muted there for a second. Just one of the states that was mentioned, the state VR director for New Hampshire, the great state of New Hampshire, Lisa Hinson-Hotz, she said she'd be willing to share work that they're doing under your E3 TA Center in New Hampshire.
Great, great. And you can, as I said, go to the website, please, projecte3.com, and they'll have more specific information about the communities in New Hampshire, why they were selected, the challenges, and what strategies we've been using there and what's working.
I actually just clicked on it just so people could see it. I assume people could see it, but it has resources, research. Oh wow, so you got some neat little database kinds of things. Neat. Sorry, I'm just getting off track here, but it's neat to see the actual website.
Thank you. Thanks for doing that. I want to get people to go to the website, so I appreciate that.
Sure. Could the community login, is it specific to the communities?
No, you can go ahead and log in. They'll give you information. As I said, we have some closed information. You can just contact the webmaster and they'll help you with information. You can also get alerts. We do a weekly thing of what's happening in E3, trainings, webinars, different things like that. As I said, all at no cost.
Cool. Cool,
Come
cool,
visit
cool. You've got news. Sorry, I should. Let's turn it over, see if there are any questions. I'm going to look through the questions and read them. Please stop covering up the closed caption. Oh, sorry. Good question. Sorry, Emily. Couple thank yous. Let's see. So I'll ask a couple questions. Is there an effort to expand to other communities? What kind of efforts are there around kind of?
Well, at this point, that's an excellent question. At this point, we are in 12 communities. I don't see us expanding. One of the things that we are doing in all the states that I listed is we're trying to disseminate information. I'll speak about Virginia because we have 2 projects in Virginia, one in Hampton Roads and one in Martinsville, Virginia. Martinsville is the poorest city in Virginia with one of the highest incidents of opioid abuse in the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we're doing is taking what we've learned there and promising practices, and we're expanding out and sharing that information in other parts of Virginia in a variety of different types of venues.
Okay. Let's see. And so, is this, I mean, in essence, it sounds like a research model demonstration, and then it could be packaged for other communities to pick up. Is that what you're thinking?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yes. That was the idea, to keep it fairly closed and not initially trying to take on too many communities.
Right. Right.
And as I said before, to find out, that was just a fraction of the different types of things that come up. What we chose and what we offered was based on what the community feedback was.
Right.
If we went into a community and they said, our issue here is transportation, then we focused on transportation first. It was whatever they said, the community said that they were interested in.
Right. Right. Is it, how much is, so is it primarily employment driven? Do you sometimes get pushed or led by the communities to other kinds of outcomes like health or community integration?
It's kind of the whole package. It's very much employment driven. However, as I mentioned before, if you don't have childcare, how are you going to be able to go to a job? And if you don't have transportation, how are you going to get to the job?
Right.
If you don't have a bank account, I mean, very few of us get paid with a paper check anymore. We have to have an account. If you've never had a bank account or you have bad credit, how do you deal with that? So you're right. It's around employment, but there's a lot of things that surround employment in order to help someone be successful.
Yeah, great. I'm going to answer some of the data questions that came in over the Q&A session. One question was, what are the main points that justify or explain the increase that we've seen in the employment either this month or over the last one? I think that probably the main point is, and I have a research assistant, and we're writing a paper on trends in other data that go further back. It really is around full employment. So when the economy reaches full employment, typically we see improvements for people with disabilities, or actually this is the first time we've seen actual improvements with all the different data sources I have. Usually it's a slowdown in the decline for people with disabilities, or like a leveling off. but it's usually around full employment when the economy reaches full employment. And so when you start seeing more advertising locally, perhaps transportation is an issue for many people with disabilities, and having local jobs open up could be one of the reasons why we see an uptick for people with disabilities. It also could be more flexible work arrangements as employers are trying to fill positions that have been open for a while. And so greater flexibility of those jobs. You know, that I'm hypothesizing on this. It's not, you know, set in stone that those are the reasons why this could be occurring, but that's my hunch, so to speak. Fernando called in to talked about the U.S. and Fernando's talking about the Brazilian labor force participation rate or inclusion ratio of being very, very small, much less of the U.S. Inclusion ratio, which he has is 21% for the U.S. and Brazil, it would be 1%. And you know, Fernando brings up the idea of whether there are laws that oblige companies to hire people with disabilities. You know, I think that you know the U.S. does have some support for supported employment. It's not typically broad. You know, a lot of employers are not getting engaged in supported employment arrangements, and we could talk more about that. But I think it's a really good point that there are some opportunities in the U.S. that might not be available in other countries. Not knowing other countries, I don't know. Here's one for you, Maureen. So Joseph asks, could you give a few more details on the motivational interviewing? Are there specific kinds of questions during the interviews? What kind of process do you use to kind of guide through those interviews?
Sure. Motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice, and it was originally developed, I'm doing this off the top of my head, and it was working with folks with substance abuse issues. And it was because there's a lot of resistance with that. It is a technique. We're very fortunate at the GW Center for Rehabilitation, Counseling, Research, and Education. I am fortunate to have a MINT, M-I-N-T, motivational interviewing national trainer who works for me and has had years of training and preparation. So it's not just, oh, you do this technique and it's motivational interviewing, a little bit more. The idea was to give human service providers and community members that we're working with some tools and techniques to help them when they dealt with resistance from folks about going to work, losing benefits, making some life changes. So I encourage you to go in, and I'd go ahead and Google it, and you can get some more information on it.
Okay, great. Great. Another question is, the idea, Joseph likes the idea of the 3 minutes and no PowerPoint, as we sit here in front of PowerPoints. How did that come about? One of the things we do is we have a wonderful trainer, DJ Ralston, who's at GW, and she's had a lot of experience working in the community. We have 40 agencies that will sometimes show up, so we don't, it could take days to get through it. The idea was to keep it short and sweet. The other thing that we do to make it a little bit more fun, if you're familiar with the music from the Academy Awards, if someone goes on too long, the music gets turned on. Yeah.
And if they keep on talking, it gets louder. So we do that, and the first time we do it, they laugh, but they get the idea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've had speakers like that.
About this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll have to bring the music next time. All right, so we have about 1 more minute left. I'm actually going to jump back to the employment trends. Cass Shepard raised the question of, it appears locally that more and more jobs are less than full-time, especially in the medical support, administrative support occupations. Is that a broad trend, or is it local experience? I'm not quite sure. You know, I don't know the data on that in terms of the long-term trend. Well, let's put it this way. I haven't seen data on that in maybe 10, 15 years, I would imagine that it's probably still true. We do have some projects under the Disability Statistics RTC where Eric Lauer has got a couple papers on occupation. And also I can ask my student to look at define employment in different ways, whether it's full-time, part-time, and whether people with disabilities are more likely to be in full or part-time. So it may be that all jobs are that way, and it could also be that people with disabilities are more likely to go into those jobs. That's either a good or a bad thing, depending on their specific situation and whether it's by choice or whether it's constrained by the availability of supports and transportation options and things like that. So that's actually a really good question to look at. We'll think about that as we go forward in our research. It's now 1 o'clock. I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you, Maureen, and everybody, Elaine and Denise. We had a nice webinar today. Glad everybody could join us. Again, everything will be archived, and we will. You can get the PowerPoints and things available online at our at Research on Disability. That's it. Bye. So that's the music calling everybody to get off the cart. All right, bye.